I'm very pleased to rise to address this motion tabled in my name. At the outset, this motion is fundamentally about celebrating and commemorating the anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which occurred on the 10th of December, 1948, almost 75 years ago. A milestone for humanity, a watershed moment forged in World War II's literal blood, sweat and tears, Mr. President. This 1948 watershed moment saw, for the first time, countries agree on a comprehensive range of fundamental rights and freedoms to which all of us are entitled. It guarantees the rights of every individual everywhere without distinction based on nationality, place of residence, gender, national or ethnic origin, religion, language or any other status. Despite the Declaration not being a binding document, it inspired more than 60 human rights instruments, which together set an international standard and reflect the general consent of all United Nations member states on those fundamental rights laid down in the Declaration. Mr. President, the signing of the UDHR is widely recognised as a milestone which has had a profound influence on the development of international human rights law. In 1966, two further international covenants were adopted: the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the ICE-SCR, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, which established the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights to which everyone is entitled. Collectively, these are known as providing the International Bill of Human Rights. Significantly, these covenants not only identify and articulate specific universal cultural and economic rights, such as freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, the right to form trade unions, the rights to freedom of religion, or the right to education, for example. These covenants also identify the responsibilities placed on states to respect, protect and fulfil those rights. And of course, by states, as a proper noun, we're referring to nation states, who are the signatories to and those who have ratified these covenants, such as the Australian Federal Government. Mr. President, by ratifying and becoming parties to these conventions, states are agreeing to particular international obligations defined by these specific responsibilities to respect, protect and fulfil the convention's expressed intent. For example, the obligation to respect means that states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. For instance, a state must refrain from preventing people from speaking their birth language. States are also expected to not only refrain from interfering with our rights, but to actively seek to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. For example, intervene to prevent hate speech being employed against citizens because of who they are, or to intervene to require equal pay for equal jobs because no matter the gender of the person doing those jobs. And further, when signing up to the covenant, states are committing to also fulfil the realisation of these rights by taking positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. So, for example, it's the state's obligation to ensure an appropriate interpreter is provided, to ensure someone who may not speak English as the first language here and is before the courts can understand the charges they are facing, for example, and are able to provide a defence. So the point here, Mr. President, is that these international human rights covenants are not just aspirational statements we signed up to, they are calls to action. And by signing up to these calls to action, we're committing to respecting, protecting and fulfilling the realisation of human rights for those within our jurisdiction. This is highlighted by this year's United Nations Human Rights Day slogan of dignity, freedom and justice for all, and a call to action of stand up for human rights. And specifically, Mr. President, the call to action to stand up for human rights is in the context of next year's 75th anniversary of the 1948 historic watershed moment of the Declaration's ratification. So the challenge we have been set is to not wait for the December next year, for that 75th anniversary, before we act to stand up for human rights in our local jurisdiction, but to instead proactively use the next 12 months to take concrete action to progress in a meaningful manner the respect for and the protection and fulfilment of the fundamental human rights enshrined in the Declaration. This gets us to the question, Mr. President, of why does Tasmania need a Human Rights Act? To quote the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, Through ratification of international human rights treaties, governments undertake to put into place domestic measures and legislation compatible with their treaty obligations and duties. Which brings us back to Tasmania, Mr President, and our role at the domestic level to actively respect, protect and fulfil our formal human rights obligations. As we are aware, there are instances where, as the state signatory to an international treaty, the Australian government will establish a legal or regulatory framework, which also requires the subnational states and territories to adopt consistent regulatory and legal frameworks. Last year, the passage through this Parliament of the OPCAT Implementation Act 2021 was an example of this, the purpose of which, to quote from the Act, was to enable the mandate set out in Article 11 of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 18th of December 2002, as amended and in force for Australia from time to time. However, at this stage, the domestic manifestation of a national human rights infrastructure by which Australia purports to fulfil its obligation under the UN Human Rights Covenants is the formation of the Australian Human Rights Commission, along with the National Human Rights Commissioners. Yet it's important to note that although so far the federal government may not have seen fit to legislate a National Human Rights Act, there's nothing preventing states and territories from doing so. As detailed in Section 5 of the motion before us, Victoria, the ACT and Queensland have all implemented their respective Human Rights Acts. Mr President, according to a recent report released by the National Human Rights Law Centre earlier this year, called Charters of Rights Make Our Lives Better, it summarises the impact of these three interstate legislated human rights acts as, and I quote, "These charters have been quietly improving people's lives in small and big ways. They have helped to ensure that people are treated with greater fairness, dignity and respect, stopping families from being evicted into homelessness, ensuring people with a disability receive appropriate support, and so much more." This Human Rights Law Centre report presents 101 case studies which demonstrate how the ACT's, Victoria's and Queensland's respective Human Rights Acts work in practice. While the report does identify where these acts could be improved or strengthened, it provides a valuable resource which presents tangible examples of how these charters are implemented and, importantly, how they've improved the lives and protected or restored the dignity of real live people in those jurisdictions. To quote further from the report, page 6 in fact, these 101 case studies show how these charters have helped governments to identify and address human rights issues affecting people at an early stage of policy development, ensured transparency around how governments and parliaments have considered people's human rights, promoted better understanding of human rights, prevented human rights issues from escalating, provided a way for people to resolve human rights issues by raising them with government and other agencies, and given people the power to take action and address human rights issues affecting them through complaint mechanisms and in the courts. Time constraints prevent me from going into these 101 examples in any detail, Mr President, but it's worthwhile emphasising the range of issues explored by these selected case studies. For example, some case studies explore how recourse to human rights acts assisted against disproportionate COVID-19 public health measures, or enabled an expectant mother to hold on to her housing tenancy, or protected a domestic violence survivor from eviction, or requiring escalators to be installed to provide accessibility. It's a fascinating report, Mr President, and one which provides very significant and in places very moving insight into the human rights challenges many people still contend with just trying to live their lives. And where and how these existing human rights acts encourage, foster or just bluntly require these challenges to be acknowledged and addressed, whether by a public authority, an individual or by the relevant government. There's so much we can learn from the case studies provided in the Human Rights Law Centre's report to deal with some of the human rights challenges and abuses experienced by many Indigenous Australians and traditional owners. It's worth noting, Mr President, that later this week, the 25th of November, will be the first year anniversary since the groundbreaking Pathway to Truth-Telling and Treaty report was tabled in this Parliament, a fundamental case of human rights requiring addressing. Hopefully we will receive a formal update from the Premier or Minister on progress on that report's recommendations to mark that significant anniversary, which again is very timely in relation to December's International Human Rights Day and Week. I'd expect that any progress on the pathway to truth-telling and treaty report would share a synergy and an urgency with the commencement of public consultation around a Tasmanian Human Rights Act as well. However, Mr President, we do not need to look beyond our shores for justification to explore whether Tasmania should introduce legislation to implement a formal human rights infrastructure, and if so, what it should look like. And further, as has been raised previously on other matters in this place, just because reforms may or may not be occurring interstate, Tasmania's elected representatives have a responsibility to act in the best interests of those who elected us here and now. So closer to home, we have a clear recommendation from the Tasmanian Law Reform Institutes, the TLRI, based on public consultation with Tasmanians, that Tasmania requires a legislated Charter of Human Rights. And in fact, we have had that recommendation with us since 2007. That's 15 years ago, Mr President. 15 years since the TLRI report entitled A Charter of Rights for Tasmania put the State Parliament on notice that human rights protection in Tasmania is, and I quote from that 2007 report, partial, disconnected and inaccessible. The first two recommendations of the TLRI report are these. Recommendation 1, enhanced protection of human rights. The Tasmanian Law Reform Institute recommends that the law be reformed to provide and promote specific, better and accessible protection for human rights. Recommendation 2, a Tasmanian Charter of Human Rights. The Tasmanian Law Reform Institute recommends the enactment of a Tasmanian Charter of Human Rights. To recap for members and anyone listening who may be unfamiliar with the 2007 TLRI report, it provides a total of 23 detailed recommendations, canvassing not only the specific rights which need to be articulated in a legislated charter, but also regarding other aspects such as education programs, implementation and periodic review, as well as the role and obligations of authorities, courts, the executive and Parliament. A comprehensive report indeed, Mr President. I'll not consume the Chamber's time now by reading out all 23 recommendations. However, they can be found on pages 4 to 14 of the TLRI 2007 report. For those wishing to familiarise themselves with the extent of that detailed work, I'd encourage people to access the full report on the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute's website. Not only is the 2007 TLRI report extensive and thorough, it's the result of thorough and extensive public consultation. This community consultation process, overseen by a specifically established Human Rights Consultation Committee consisting of TLRI representatives, as well as representatives from community advocacy groups and the private sector, formally commenced in September 2006, when the Tasmanian Attorney-General at that time, the Honourable Steve Cons MP, launched the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute issues paper, A Charter of Rights for Tasmania, and called for submissions about the project from the Tasmanian community. Mr President, 407 submissions were received in total, 355 of those from individuals and 52 from organisations. At the time of releasing the report in 2007, the TLRI stated in a media release that this was the largest number of original submissions received on any project undertaken by the Institute. Significantly, 383, that's 94% of those submissions, supported the enactment of a Charter of Human Rights to better protect human rights in Tasmania. Further, that significant number of submissions were received from a broad cross-section of the community, including people living in rural areas, family-based groups, Indigenous Tasmanians, political and non-political organisations, pensioners groups, students, professional groups, members of the gay, lesbian, transgender and bisexual community, young people, people with disabilities, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, women's groups and faith-based groups. The TLRI report, when summarising the submissions received, states this: while it's recognised that a process that calls for submissions cannot claim to result in a representative response in the way that analyses based on random selection do, the responses received are consistent with findings of an ACP Morgan opinion poll conducted in 2006, which showed that 81% of Tasmanians favoured the enactment of a Charter of Human Rights. This was the highest support rate of any Australian jurisdiction. That was from page 153 of the TLRI report. Yet, Mr President, despite this high degree of community engagement and support and the very clear advice received from the TLRI 15 years ago, and while acknowledging some interim steps towards implementation by former governments, the Parliament has not acted in that time. Hence the TLRI agreeing to recently re-examine and contemporise the case for a human rights law in Tasmania. It's expected this imminent report, updating report, will add further weight to the findings of its original report and also the ongoing public campaign for law reform in this critical area. As noted in the 2007 TLRI report, and I quote, "Tasmanians are not protected by any state or federal charter or Bill of Rights. Australia is now the only common law country that does not have a national Bill of Rights." And further, the TLRI summarised the situation as this: in Tasmania, a patchwork of sources provide a protection of human rights, including the Tasmanian and Australian constitutions, international law, common law, and state and federal laws. However, the protections offered by these sources are fragmented and incomplete. Working out what rights are protected, when and how, is a complex task. Yet this motion, Mr President, is not asking this chamber or the government to here and now commit to immediately implementing a legislated human rights charter for Tasmania, nor does it even ask us to commit to any particular model of human rights charter. However, it does ask us to support moving forward Tasmania's public debate on implementing a legislated Charter of Rights to address the current patchwork of fragmented and incomplete protections as identified by the TLRI 15 years ago. By supporting this motion, we're asking the government to commence a current and contemporary public consultation process on a Tasmanian Human Rights Act, which would both build upon the strong foundations set by the 2007 report and presumably the TLRI's imminent review of the current situation, as well as provide a concrete example of seeking to respect, protect and fulfil human rights protections and responsibilities. While the TLRI presented a clear case for a Tasmanian Human Rights Act, they did not provide a draft bill by which to do so, and nor was that their brief. That would be the appropriate role for the Parliament, and more specifically the government. Hence, Clause 9 of the motion presents the crux of the motion, and it says, urges the government to consider making the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by initiating consultation on a Human Rights Act for Tasmania. The motion does not ask the government to repeat the community consultation regarding whether Tasmania should or should not implement a Charter of Rights, but instead to consider progressing that debate from where it has stalled and to begin the process of formally drafting and discussing how such a legislated Charter of Rights would look and operate in respect to respect, protect and fulfil our human rights in this state. Further, it's important to acknowledge this motion does not seek to lock in either the government or any other member to support any future human rights bill or model. Instead, it merely seeks to reboot the stalled legislative discussion within the framework of the next 12 months, leading up to that significant 75th anniversary of that momentous international human rights milestone. The 75th anniversary, Mr President, is even more momentous than a platinum jubilee. And if we have seen this year all stops pulled out to celebrate an individual's platinum jubilee, surely we can do the same for this collective commemoration of equality, dignity and common humanity. Just a quick note, Mr President, it's worth noting that support for this motion does not preempt the release of the TLRI's imminent update on their initial 2007 report, in the sense that this motion's call to action is framed within the period of the next 12 months. As previously stated, it was due to more than a decade gap between the 2007 clear and detailed recommendation for a legislated Charter of Rights that the TLRI agreed to undertake a review, looking to potentially update and contemporise the current situation. Initially, it was thought that review would already have been released by this time, but as acknowledged in the recent independent review of the TLRI, some of these projects have been unavoidably delayed due to resourcing and staffing constraints experienced by the Institute. However, I believe it's hoped the finalised review will be released shortly, and in which case it will be available to contribute to and help to inform the government's considerations of whether, and if so how, to initiate community consultation processes on the development and implementation of a Human Rights Act for Tasmania. Mr President, I said at the outset that this motion was tabled in my name, and in fact, as much of the work is that we bring forward in this place, this motion is tabled and debated in the name of many other Tasmanians. It's a great honour when debating this motion to be doing so for all those Tasmanians who had and continue to fight to protect and maintain the inalienable human rights for themselves and fellow Tasmanians. It's also a great honour when debating this motion to be continuing the advocacy of the many who have campaigned and those who continue to campaign for a Tasmanian Human Rights Act. A vote progressing the formal consideration of a Tasmanian Human Rights Act is not just a vote for ourselves or for the benefit of a particular sector or industry. It's a vote for all of us. And most importantly, it's a vote acknowledging the primacy of the inalienable rights of all Tasmanians, no matter their gender, their race, the colour of their skin, religion, sexual orientation or their country of origin. And as per the rallying call of the Alliance for Tasmanians for a Tasmanian Human Rights Act, my rights matter, your rights matter, our rights matter. To conclude, Mr President, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed on the 10th of December 1948, although a milestone, it was not considered an end in itself. Instead, drafters of the document and signatories to the declaration at that time were clear. It was a beginning, an international collective starting point. It sets a framework and a benchmark towards which we as a global community must continue to strive, at the international, state and domestic levels. Sadly, it's no exaggeration or hyperbolic acknowledgement that over the last 75 years we've witnessed some historic shadows, if you like, re-emerge, and not always on the periphery. We've been forced to see that some of those lessons, presumed to have been irrevocably learned, to be engraved on our collective memory permanently, sadly may not be so. And hence it's important to not lose sight of the fact that the designated annual observance of the UDHR signing anniversary is not only about celebrating a significant historic achievement, but also an opportunity for us to take an annual human rights health check. How are we travelling in Tasmania right here, right now, when measured against the Declaration of Human Rights? How consistently and rigorously are we delivering this mandate without fear or favour? What achievements can we reiterate and reinforce? And also, most importantly, where can ongoing improvements be made? And to reiterate, in relation to that last question, Mr President, this motion presents a positive and constructive proposal to mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the government initiating public consultation on a Human Rights Act for Tasmania as we look ahead to that anniversary in 12 months' time. In the 75th anniversary year of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what better tribute could we pay to the foresight and humanity demonstrated by our forebears who drove and delivered that 1948 milestone, to the Australian legislators who signed up to deliver on that declaration's principles, and to our former and current fellow Tasmanians working to protect and enhance our inalienable rights here and now, than to formally engage with our community by initiating public consultation on a Human Rights Act for Tasmania, and how it can assist us to meet those agreed obligations of respecting, protecting and fulfilling our human rights. And last but not least, Mr President, I wish again to place on the record my thanks and appreciation to all members of the Alliance for a Tasmanian Human Rights Act and others for their dedication and work to progress this important issue on behalf of our community. I applaud their efforts to remind us that there is more we can do to both celebrate and protect our fellow Tasmanians' inalienable human rights, as well as foster Tasmania's human rights reputation. I wish them well for this Saturday's public event, highlighting how we can still do more in this fundamentally important space. Just as we celebrate the historic milestone and watershed achievement of the 10th of December 1948, let's all work to progress Tasmania's own historic human rights milestone and watershed achievements in 2023. My rights, your rights, our rights matter. I commend this motion to the House.